Welcome to Barnes & Noble on Union Square. Tonight it's a pleasure to have C-SPAN's Book Notes' Brian Lamb with us tonight. He is the author of a new book, Book Notes: Life Stories, Notable Biographers on the People Who Shaped America. He will be joined tonight by Ron Chernow, Robert Caro, and Blanche Wiesen-Cook. Please join me in welcoming Brian Lamb.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Barnes & Noble and an evening of biography and three very interesting human beings. We're together tonight because of a book and because of a program called Book Notes. This is our second book. We actually kicked off our last tour in this place with a crowd very similar to this one. And it worked so well, the folks at Times Books asked us to do this again, and we thought it was a good idea, so here we are. Tonight, the early part of this will be a discussion from our three guests about their work, and then we'll open this thing up to questions. And I think most of you in this room know who these three people are. But to start things off, I want to ask each one of them to kind of bring us up to date as to where they are in their own writing life and when their next book's coming out, and maybe a little bit about their experiences with their books up to now, and just a brief period, and then we'll go into, I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll throw this thing open to questions from you all or comments. Let's start right down here with Bob Caro, and he is the man who's worked, how many years now, Bob, on LBJ?
15.
There's a picture in the book. One of the great fun things for me was taking the pictures in this book and getting a chance to know these authors a little bit better. There's a picture in the book of Bob in his office. I won't tell you exactly where it is, but it's over somewhere on West 57th Street. I'm sure he would just soon people not knock on his door. But he spends a lot of time in that room, and I think one of the things that I learned was interesting being there is that he always dresses up in a tie and a coat when he goes to work, even though no one's there with him when he's writing. Tell us where you are in the next LBJ book.
Brian, you're the second person today who asked me that question. The first one was my publisher. Well, I'm working on the third volume of Lyndon Johnson. It's called Master of the Senate. It's about how Johnson rises to power in the Senate and then proceeds to make it work, as it's never worked before or since. I'm about 90% done, which means that I have about 1 year to go.
But the whole package, I think people miss, I know I did, the whole package of LBJ books includes what? You've done 2, how many more to do?
Well, as Churchill said when he was working on his biography of Marlborough, I'm working on the 4th of a projected 3 volumes. This was supposed to be 3 volumes, as I think I told you once years ago. It's now 4 volumes, and when I finish, I want to turn it into a 1-volume, Life of Lyndon Johnson.
Blanche Wiesen-Cook wrote a book on Eleanor Roosevelt, and the day I took her picture, it was raining. But we had a lot of fun. It was over at 72nd Street on the east side, west side, near Riverside Park, the statue of Eleanor Roosevelt. And the only thing I regret in the picture that we have in the book is that we can't show her red boots that she has on tonight. She had them on that day. It was great. Tell us where you are in volume 2.
Thank you, Brian. Yesterday, the 9th of March, 1999, 3 is my lucky number, I finished the acknowledgments and bibliography, having the day before finished the last of what my editor will faint when she sees is over 140 or 50 pages of footnotes. And in my acknowledgments, I say, dear reader, please look at the footnotes, the last refuge for exiled material. And Bob Caro doesn't know this, but he's my hero. One of the best books in the English language is his marvelous biography of Robert Moses, the power broker. And when I first started working on Eleanor Roosevelt, I asked him how many manuscript pages, do you remember that I asked you that? I asked him how many manuscript pages this wonderful book came in at, because I was then thinking I was doing a 1-volume biography of what is now at least a 3-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. and I had many thousands of pages, and you told me 3,000 pages. So that gave me strength to deal with this towering pile, which is now, the second volume will come out in July. And there's something rather extraordinary about writing Eleanor Roosevelt's life at this incredibly mean-spirited time, because she was a very great and good woman. And her vision was that nobody should suffer. And as an orphan, orphaned at 10, when her father died, her mother died when she was 8, and she never lived in a home of her own. Her passion was that everybody would have a home of their own. And she actually created a community called Arthurdale, which is in West Virginia. And my partner Claire Koss and I went there, and we spent a lot of time there. This is the most ridiculed and snickered at community in American history. But it's a beautiful community in which 83% of the original residents and their descendants still live there. Homes were built on 3 to 5 acres in the poorest areas of Appalachia. And Eleanor Roosevelt had a dream that people would really live well. And she said, let's have indoor plumbing here in the mountains of West Virginia. And people were aghast. The Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, who's the father of the Harold Ickes you know so well, said, well, if Eleanor Roosevelt had her way, how can we tell the rich from the poor? And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, in matters of such simple dignity, we should not have to tell the rich from the poor. And so every one of these beautiful homes was built with electricity, indoor plumbing, sinks and bathtubs and toilets at a time when 80% of rural America, country America, didn't have those things. And today, writing about that at a time when nobody notices there are 9 million homeless Americans is a very challenging fact. And you sort of wonder, why doesn't anybody seem to notice that there are, I mean, the government admits there are between 7 and 9 million, but if they admit between 7 and 9 million, I think we can take the top figure. Why isn't this a political issue? And so there are issues like this that are of such immediate urgency, and then there are things like health care. And folks don't realize, and I have another question for Bob Caro. LBJ was the first president to take Social Security money and use it for the general funding of the Great Society, and I want to know how he got away with that and how he did that, but that's another story. With this war against Social Security, folks don't realize that it came in segregated. Over 80% of African American women and men were excluded from it. Over 60% of working women were excluded from it. And it was supposed to have 4 components. One component in 1935 was to be a national health security component, a national health care proposal. And that, of course, was on the cutting room floor. And Eleanor Roosevelt campaigned for these things. So on every issue, I've been very engaged, and it's been very exciting, and I hope the book will come out in July and folks will begin to think of all the things we have to do again and again and again.
With Ron Chernow, the interview is much more fresh in my mind because it was just last year. And there are 2 things that I remember most from the experience of either interviewing Ron Chernow or taking his picture. When I interviewed him, it was one of the worst experiences for him in the history of book notes, I can tell you, because for some reason or other, the building in which we live at C-SPAN in Washington, they like to drill a lot. Usually you can't hear it when you're watching, but the day that Ron and I did the interview, it seemed like it would not stop, and we don't like to ever stop these interviews, but it got so intense that we on 2 occasions had to stop, and then our folks have to find the drill wherever it is in the building, and you can't find it, of course, because if they're drilling on the 7th floor in the other wing, it still comes all the way around to where our studio is. he was very patient. I'll never forget that. After the interview, we went down to the portrait gallery to take a picture for the book. And there's a statue down there of John D. Rockefeller Sr. And I took a bunch of pictures. And then with there are 32 pictures in the book, and I took at least 50 pictures of each person to get one. It's about 1,500 photographs altogether. But the day we were there to take the picture of Ron Chernow, the picture I liked the most, about a week later, I'm going to wring his neck if he told me it was his idea, showed up in the Washington Post. And we were all, Susan Swain is here tonight, and she had a lot to do with this book, and we were looking, when we finally came down to decide what photograph we were going to use, and his was one of the last we chose, we said, we're not going to have the same photo that showed up in the Washington Post. So the photo that's in the book is Ron Chernow nose to nose with the John D. Rockefeller statue. Tell us something about, either you're just at the end of a book tour, but what if anything you're writing on next?
Sure. Let me just first say it's a pleasure to be on a panel with two writers whom I not only admire but who write long, which is very nice, because if you write long books, you're subject to a lot of very cruel humor from TV and a radio host. Brian would be an exception to this rule, but very often the cameras are rolling, the interview starts, and the host is sitting there, you know, with the book in his hand. So already you're starting with a complaint. So I don't need to be self-conscious with Blanche and Bob about length. Actually, for a long time, I thought that my next book would be Andrew Carnegie, and it turns out that it's going to be Alexander Hamilton, even though a short biography of Hamilton is coming out now. The reason is that I spent 5 years working on John D. Rockefeller. I think that at this rate, I will spend 5 years publicizing the book. You know, the problem with having a successful book, you feel like the dog, you know, with the can tied to your tail, and it's in my case, it's Rockefeller. What attracted me to Hamilton is that I've been somewhat frustrated with my previous books that I've been labeled a business historian. And while clearly there's a lot of business in the books, I feel that there's much political histories and social histories, that history is a great mansion. There are many different doors. I have entered through the door marked business, but I feel that when you get inside the mansion, it is the same mansion. Hamilton was a very attractive subject, not only because it puts me into a different century, but I thought it would be a very, very good crossover figure in terms of somebody who would enable me to have a certain continuity with the economic interests that I had, but who would also get me into a very wide range of political and social issues at the same time.
You mentioned Alexander Hamilton, and one of the things that you all have done to me, or for me, is to get me out of my chair and out into the country and into historical sites, which has been a fabulous experience. And today, I was with Rick Brookhiser, who has written the book on Alexander Hamilton, and we went to Trinity Parish down at Wall and Broad Street, did a little interview at the gravesite of Alexander Hamilton, and then we went over to Weehawken, where the duel occurred back in 1804, which I've always wanted to do since I did another book on book notes on the duel. It's just very interesting and important when you can to go out there and see where these places are. I was pleasantly surprised about how well they have outfitted this duel site. I think they've had trouble over the years, but it's very nice right now. It's at 42nd Street, by the way, if you've never been over there, right straight across. Those of you who want to go over and hang around the Alexander Hamilton Aaron Burr site. I want to ask this group, and these are little questions that I think are fun and interesting, and they turn out to be important, I think, in the end. Tell us a place that you have gone in researching your books that mattered to you in what you eventually thought about in what you wrote. And start with Bob Caro. Give us an example of a trip you made that changed your mind.
Well, I guess the easiest one to think of off the top of my head is the hill country of Texas. You know, when I started doing my biographies of Lyndon Johnson, there had already been 17 biographies written. And they all talked about his boyhood. So I thought that I wouldn't have to do much original research. I just go interview some people in the hill country for color. So we moved down to Austin, where the Johnson Library, the documents are. And every evening when the library closed at 5, I'd drive out to the hill country. In those days, as soon as you left Austin, now Austin's a big city, but in those days it was much smaller. And as soon as you left Austin, in about 10 miles, you were out in this empty, isolated place, just barren. And I began to realize that I was coming into something that I had never encountered before, because I'm a city boy. I was born and brought up in New York. And I'll never forget, first time I saw Johnson City. You drive out of Austin about 40 miles, and you come to something which is called Round Mountain, but it's just like a rise. You know, the hill country, the early settlers called it the land of endless horizons, because every time you came to the top of one ridge of hills, there was another ridge, and they stretched away endlessly. And I got to I was driving, and as I got to the top of this ridge, there was this tremendous empty space in front of me. It was a huge valley, miles long and miles across. And I stopped the car and got out by the side of the road, and I looked down into this space, and at first you thought there was not a single human thing in this entire expanse. And then something happened. The sun came from behind a cloud, or the light shifted or something, and you saw light, the sun glinting off rooftops. And down in the middle of this emptiness was this tiny huddle of houses, which was Johnson City. When Lyndon Johnson grew up there were 323 people living there. When I got there weren't very many more. And as I was interviewing these people over and over again, they'd say to me, you know, you're a city boy. You can't understand Lyndon Johnson because you'll never understand Lyndon unless you understand the land. Well, I don't know about you, but to me, this seemed like a line out of a grade B Western. You never understand the land. But I came to realize that they meant something very specific, that they lived in a land where nature was all that matters. If you made a mistake, if you picked the wrong land for your ranch, as Lyndon Johnson's fathers did, you would be plunged in poverty forever with no safety net. There was nothing to cushion your fall. And I finally said to my wife, you know, I don't understand these people, and I don't understand the mores of the culture. We're going to have to move up there. And we did. We rented a house outside of Austin, up towards the hill country, and for large parts of 3 years, I spent driving around there.
It's called dedication. Blanche Cook, how about you?
We really tried as far as possible to go everywhere Eleanor went. And there are two answers to this. In the South, in Warm Springs, Georgia, and in Arthurdale, West Virginia, I really had a sense of how radical Eleanor Roosevelt was. In Warm Springs, Georgia, we met with people who knew her and who disliked her. And when I probed and pushed and finally got an answer to why they were still 60 years later so angry at her, a woman said, well, first of all, she was always meddling in things that were none of her business. And that turned out to be, FDR had built a brick school for white children. And she said it was really important to build a brick school for black children. And she did. And it was called the Eleanor Roosevelt School. And folks are still angry about that in Warm Springs, Georgia. I mean, white folks, some white folks are still angry about that. And that, I mean, 60 years later, that was very important to me. Then I got a fabulous insight into Eleanor Roosevelt at what I think was the most fun moment of my research. There's a lake up in the high Sierra, which everybody thinks is named after Theodore Roosevelt. It's 13,000 feet up above Yosemite National Park, and it's called Lake Roosevelt, but it's not named after Theodore Roosevelt. It's named after Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's no path leading up there. But we decided we were going to go up there because we go to Yosemite a lot. And we tried several times to get there and couldn't. It's always snowy, it's always cold, it's always icy. And one time we got halfway up and we were turned back by an incredible electric storm. The lightning was bouncing off our boots. And I decided we needed professional help. Probably the whole idea made it necessary for us to get professional help. But I called up a very wonderful naturalist and writer named Elizabeth Stone O'Neill, who has written wonderful books about the High Sierra and the Tuolumne Meadows, and a biography of the great naturalist Carl Shaw-Smith. And I said, hello, I'm Blanche Cook. I want to do this. Would you help me? And she said, who are you? And I told her my name, and she said, "I'm reading your book." And she loved my book, and as I love her books. And so we met in California the next year, and she was almost 80, and she said, I'm not going to take you up there, but I'll find the perfect people to take you up. And we went up with a woman named Victoria Hoover. It was a bipartisan trip then. And she was a guide for the Sierra Club and a wonderful naturalist and Yosemite resident. There's actually a little community of folks who were able once many decades ago to settle in the Yosemite. And Claire and I went up. And it's a wonderful, mysterious, icy lake, 13,000 feet up, surrounded by heather and larchpole and tiny wildflowers above the tree line, snowbanks all around, even in August. And it was not quite a stroll. And my big understanding about Eleanor Roosevelt after going up there, because we were in very good shape, we hike all the time and ride horses, not as much as Eleanor Roosevelt does, but, you know, we're not in terrible shape. Unlike Lorena Hickok, who she went up to the lower young lakes with, and of course, Hick didn't go up 13,000 feet. But Eleanor Roosevelt, in her memoirs, has a very mean sentence about how Lorena Hickok, who smoked all the time and was overweight, really didn't have a very pleasant time up there. Now, I have to tell you, even if you don't smoke a lot, and even if you're not overweight, there's not much air up there. You know, and you have to sit down and drink some water and catch your breath. And that was the first inkling I had that Eleanor Roosevelt had kind of a mean streak. And that was very important to me. So that, and that was also the most exciting trip that we had.
In the book notes with Ron Chernow, I remember you telling the story about John D. Rockefeller's father and how he had two wives in two different parts of the country. And believe it or not, I've been to the graveside of the father of John D. Rockefeller Sr. in Freeport, Illinois, because that's where we went back to do the Lincoln-Douglas debate speech a couple months ago, because we had done that. So I found the gravesite. It is still there, by the way, and I have you to thank for that.
I'd love to tell that story because, you know, for any writers or would-be writers in the audience, this is a terrific tale about research. Norman Mailer once said, a factoid is something that, fiction that has been repeated often enough to acquire the status of a fact. And one of the things that I discovered when I started writing about John D. Rockefeller, whose father, as Brian indicated, was a bigamist and a con man, a snake oil artist, a thoroughly disreputable scoundrel. One thing that was repeated in every single biography of Rockefeller was that his father was buried in an unmarked grave in Freeport, Illinois. And it was repeated so often that I just assumed that it was true. One day I happened to come upon the name of a cemetery in Freeport, and on a lark I picked up the telephone, got the number, and called, and a young man answered. And it must have been a slow day in the cemetery. I guess there were no burials that day. And I said, I'm calling from New York. I'm a biographer. I'm writing about John D. Rockefeller, and you have an opportunity to make history. I have reason to think that John D. Rockefeller's father may be buried in your cemetery there. And he said to me, you know, when I was hired, somebody mentioned that Rockefeller's son was buried here. So I said, no, it would be Rockefeller's father. So I said, do you think that you could find that gravestone? He said, well, you know, it's a slow day, nothing's cooking today. And so I said, well, before you go out, I should tell you that if you find the gravestone, it may not say Rockefeller, it may say Dr. William Livingston, which is the alias, and it was the name under which Rockefeller's second wife knew him. They were married for 51 years. For the first 49 years of the marriage, she had no idea that her husband's real name was Rockefeller and that he was the father of the richest man in the world. So I said, you may see the name Livingston and not Rockefeller. He called back 20 minutes later and he said, found it. I said, you did? He said, yep, William Livingston. He gave me the dates they checked out. He gave me Margaret's dates they checked out. I said, you just made history. It took one phone call and 20 minutes to overturn 100 years of mythology on this subject. It reminds me of the story, in fact, Bob tells it in the Book Notes anthology, about tracking down the guy who had perjured himself about, was it the 48 election, and everybody had just assumed as a matter of course that this could not be verified, and as you very modestly pointed out, nobody had really tried very hard before. So very often, I mean, you know, one of the pleasures, I think, of biography is to start completely fresh, not to accept as accurate anything that has been said before, and to actually build a new edifice from the ground up. That's when history is good.
Over the last 10 years of Book Notes, and that's how old it'll be in April, a question that I've asked, because I will never be a great writer under any circumstances, and I need all the help I can get just to get the editing done on this and the introduction done, thanks to Susan Swain and the team that helped it. But the thing that I learned the most over these years, and I think the thing that a lot of people like to hear about, is where people write, how they write, when they write, and that whole experience, especially people who are either writing or are interested in that. So I want to ask each of the three to go through that scenario. I know, having been to Bob Caro's office, one of the fascinating things about his office, besides that there's not much in it, and in the picture in Book Notes, the book, you can see the outline of the next book. But he has that typewriter sitting there near his desk that is, at the time I took the picture, one of 17, and I asked him tonight, how many do you have left? And they don't make these anymore. He said that he has 14 left because he has to cannibalize them. Tell us more about how you write and where you write.
Well, I write in longhand, my first few drafts, and then I do several drafts on a typewriter. It's the same typewriter that I used when I first went into, same type of typewriter that I used when I went into writing. I guess I don't change because I'm afraid that something will happen to my writing. I know how things are supposed to feel. I've been doing it for so long. I don't think you can explain this to anybody, you know. People say, but if you use a computer, you don't have to change the paragraphs around. You don't have to retype everything. But the fact is that I've never, that I can think of, retyped the page to correct one thing, that I didn't find something else that I wanted to change. And maybe if I hadn't retyped it, I never would have found that. I worked in all sorts of places. You know, when I was doing The Power Broker, I used to go and sit out in Jones Beach, because when Robert Moses was young, he used to take this little motorboat over to Jones Beach, which was then a completely deserted sandbar. And he would say to me, when I would get off out of the boat, I'd pull it up through the weeds. Sometimes there wouldn't be a single other human being on Jones Beach. I'd be there all alone. So I'd try and go there very early in the day, when no one, or as few people, and try to find a place where there was nobody, and try to feel the way Robert Moses felt. And of course, I talked about the hill country. You know, you can't really, one of the things that I did, and then I won't go on anymore, was I realized there was a loneliness there that had played a big role in the way Lyndon Johnson was when he grew up. I, of course, didn't know what loneliness was, but Lyndon's brother Sam Houston used to talk about how there wasn't one other human being, how he and Lyndon would sometimes go down to the fence at the corner of the Johnson Ranch, which was closest to where the Austin-Fredericksburg Road, which is really just a gravel path, ran then. And Sam Houston and Lyndon would sit on this fence all day, hoping that one person would ride by so they'd have one new person to talk to. So what I would do if I was writing a chapter, and I didn't feel I was getting it, I would take a sleeping bag and I would go out there and I would make myself have to bring something for dinner. Then I'd sleep there, because I wanted to get up the next day with there still not being anyone there, and see what things, and what you really notice. You notice things you might never have noticed. How important it is when you see a rabbit, you know, or a hawk in the sky or something. And again, how much larger than life your father, if you were like Lyndon Johnson's father, would loom in your life if there was no one else around.
You know, I mentioned earlier that you come to work every day on your own, wear a tie and a coat no matter what, and work sometimes 7 days a week. How often How often do you have a stretch of time that you write that goes on for weeks at a time? You don't, and you go. I mean, you do that, and you don't take a break.
Well, I've had one. Yes, but that exaggerates how hard I work. I mean, it sounds good. I mean, I have really not had a day off. Well, I sometimes take a day off when you get too tired, but I try not to take a day off when I'm doing something that's supposed to be in the same mood, because it's too hard to get back into it. So I might work, I mean, sometimes it's just a page or two, right? But sometimes it might be several chapters, and then you work for months. Right now I've been working on something that's been going on for months, but that's, as I say, it exaggerates, because then I'm entitled to a vacation, so I take a long one.
Why do you wear the tie and coat every day?
Because I went to Horace Mann. And when I went to Horace Mann, you had to wear a tie and a jacket. You had to carry a pocket comb and have a pocket handkerchief. And at any time, one of the teachers could come up to you and demand that you produce your pocket comb and your pocket handkerchief. And if you couldn't, you got demerits. So I got in the habit. That's a very serious question, actually, because sometimes you feel like a nut doing it. But for me, when I was a reporter, you know, when you had the discipline of the daily deadline, and when I was starting to think about the Power Broker, and I thought about how long it would take to do it, I realized that by nature I'm rather lazy, and if I didn't have something to remind myself that I was going to work, that I would waste a lot of time, because nobody cares. No one wants to hear from you for years at a time, and or ever. But that's a way of reminding myself that I'm going to work. You know, you do other things. I'm sure a lot of writers do them. I mean, I keep a word count of how many words I do a day. They're all just little tricks to keep going.
Blanche Cook, where do you write?
I write in the woods. We have a little house in the woods, and I write in the woods. And until Eleanor Roosevelt, I wrote longhand with a fountain pen. And one day I wrote Eisenhower entirely longhand, and my pen broke, and I went into this town on the east end of Long Island trying to get a good nib, and I couldn't for my fountain pen. And I saw a computer store, East End Computers, and so I walked in, and it's been 18 years that I've been on a word processor, on a computer, but I'm a Luddite, so this is very hard for me. And for 18 years I've had this old, you know, WordStar 5.5. And then John Jay bought me a new computer. And so I was very happy with this new computer. I'm not even on email yet, because I'm really a Luddite, and I don't know how to do it. But I was very happy with this new computer, only it ate up my chapters when I was trying to do footnotes. And so rather than have a nervous breakdown, which is, I mean, if you're a Luddite and you're on a computer that's eating up your words, this is very upsetting. And I called some of my friends and said, you know, I'm having a nervous breakdown because this computer is eating up my words. And all these folks rushed to my office. I have this very nice little office on 58th Street where John Jay is, and where this great big new powerful computer is. And all the computer specialists came, and all my friends came, and this office was filled with 10 people for about 3 weeks, making sure that I didn't lose my mind, which was about to happen on these footnotes. And now I'm very slowly working into what everybody uses, which I gather is WordPerfect. But, you know, I mean, I don't even know how to center yet in WordPerfect. But, so I'm moving into the new era, but it's very hard for me. And I really do like to write longhand, and my first drafts are longhand, and then I put them on, you know, I type them in. And I want to say one thing about this. When you wrote longhand, somebody else, for most of us, maybe not for Bob, but for most of us, did the typing. And I think that what all of us dependent and devoted to our computers means is that we're doing it all. And it's really the speed up. And I think I work many more hours. I work all the time. I work endlessly. And my friends now think I'm not social anymore because I haven't been for years. So there's something about these computers and writers. We also write fatter books, I think. I think that's why we write fatter books. We wrote thinner books when we had to write them longhand. So I think it's a kind of interesting reality.
Now, we asked Bob Carroll what he wore when he wrote, so I got to do the same thing with you. What do you wear?
I wear blue jeans when I write, and most of the time, and black jeans to dress up.
What time of the day do you write?
I tend to write at night. I tend to write beginning about 9 o'clock at night, and then I write until about 7 in the morning, and then I sleep most of the day.
Do you listen to music?
No. Sometimes. I take breaks. I take breaks and watch Brian Lamb on C-SPAN.
Yeah, sure. Ron Chernow, how about your writing
Well,
experience?
I actually think that most writers are working most of the time, if not all of the time. I remember that Thurber said that his wife could tell when they were at a party, he would get a certain look in his eye, and he was secretly writing, and she would say, "Stop writing, Thurber." So in a way, we're working all of the time. I guess what you're asking is when we're sort of formally sitting down in front of the desk or the word processor. As I listen to Bob talk about Sleeping Bag and Blanche about the woods, I realize I'm thoroughly addicted to the bourgeois comforts of life because I've never done anything, remotely that's Spartan while I'm working. In terms of the actual writing, I work on a computer, which actually for me has been a blessing because I'm a born reviser. I can't put a sentence or a paragraph down on the page without immediately beginning to rewrite it. And so people, say to me, "How many times do you rewrite everything?" And I say, "I really don't know. 25 times, 50 times." I think that the single thing that non-writers don't know about professional writers is just simply how much rewriting they do. In terms of the research, my methods are very primitive. I record all of the information by hand on 4x6 index cards, and by the time I finished Titan, I had about 25,000 index cards of information. And this seems like a very sort of laborious way to go about things. But actually, the 4x6 index card, with the possible exception of the personal computer, was the greatest thing ever devised for writers because you can very quickly move it around to have like these shoebox size boxes. You can quickly move it around, and you could actually, number one, you can establish a narrative. You can see at a glance, where your research is ample and where it's skimpy by the number of cards filed in a particular place, which I find very helpful. And so, whatever works, works. My biggest fear with the index cards is fire. Last year, I kept thinking that a fire could destroy several years of work, that I would not have the time or motivation to reproduce. So I went out and I investigated at different stationery stores. I said, "Can you sell me a fireproof filing cabinet?" And finally, they said to me that most filing cabinets, there's a little slit, where you pull out the drawer, and they said the fire can get in there. I said, no, I want something that's absolutely fireproof. So they showed me the brochures. These were filing cabinets that were lined with cement. And they said that this would actually withstand nuclear winter. So I said, okay, that's it. I ordered like $3,000 or $4,000, worth of these cement-lined filing cabinets, and they arrived at our brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, and 4 very husky men were standing on the sidewalk, sort of looking up at the stoop, and they said, "We will never get these into your house." And so I said, "Can you go back and bring some more people, because this is important?" So I said, "Well, frankly, these things are so heavy that if we get them up the stairs, probably the structural walls of the brownstone will not support it, and that the filing cabinets will actually crash through the floor, and it'd be kind of like, the China syndrome. It would they'd crash all the way down to the basement." So anyway, if anybody in the audience has a solution to this problem, quietly come up to me after.
They're still on the sidewalk?
No, they took it back. Oh. No, they refused to bring it into the house. They asked me if I was insured, and I said no.
I have 100 other questions, but I think it's time to let you all get involved in this. And anything goes. You can ask an individual author a question, or all 3, and we'll keep them all involved in one way or the other. Who wants to step up to the microphone first? We have a questioner there. Go right ahead. Yeah. You're helping. Okay. Well, While somebody's deciding whether to come up and ask a question, I'll continue asking this group some more. Is there somebody with a question? Yeah, we need. Well, we've got a handheld microphone if we can get it for the television audience, and I think the rest of the folks might be able to hear you. Go right ahead.
My question is for Mr. Chernow. Did nobody think of looking for William Avery Rockefeller's grave site by using the name Livingston? Do you suppose? Is that why he was in an unmarked grave?
Nobody had tried, period. I mean, one of the sad and depressing lessons that you learn in this business is that most of your colleagues are plain lazy. It was interesting that at the time that Ida Tarbell was running her famous expose of the Standard Oil Company between 1902 and 1904, she reproduced a picture of Rockefeller's father. And everybody in Freeport, Illinois read McClure's magazine, and they said, boy, he's the spitting image of our Dr. William Livingston. It didn't occur to anyone that, in fact, he was Dr. William Livingston. And so as I was doing the research, I went back through back issues of the Freeport Journal-Standard, and for the last 90 years, at about 5 or 10 year intervals, there have been feature articles in the local newspapers speculating as to whether Rockefeller's father was actually in this grave. Again, it apparently didn't occur to anyone in the town to really carry the research further. So the outside world wasn't going in, and the inside world wasn't going out. But I think that anybody who's done history or biography could tell very similar stories about taking something that you had been told was impossibly difficult to find or verify, and then it turned out to be embarrassingly easy.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Carroll, why Lyndon Johnson?
Well, let's see how fast I can answer that. I was never interested in writing biographies just to tell the stories of famous men. I was always, from the first time I thought of writing a biography of Robert Moses, I thought about using biography as a means of illuminating political power, because political power shapes all our lives. The Power Broker, to me, was never primarily about Robert Moses. It was about how urban political power really works, not just in New York, but in all the cities of America in the 20th century. And that's what I wanted to show. Since he was never elected to anything, where did this power come from? How did he hold it for 44 years? You have to pick the right man if you're going to do this. Moses was, I felt anyway, the right man to try to do that. And all the time I was doing The Power Broker, I never thought I'd get to do another book, because we were broke all the time that I was writing it, and all I wanted to do was finish it so I could get back to a real job again. And but all the time I was doing it, I came to realize that that's what I really wanted to do in my books, and this was urban power, and for the next I wanted to do national power. And in the second half of the 20th century, to me, the person who understood how national political power worked better than any other politician was Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chernow and Mr. Lamb, I'm so thrilled you went to Weehawken today. I spent some of my young years there. I understand that Alexander Hamilton was not, the duel was not at that point where the plaque is. And maybe you could speak to this. I believe it was on the Elysian Fields, which is below that point, along the river. And I have some information on this if you're interested, but could you expand on that a little bit, or have you gotten to that point yet?
I have just started the book, and I mean just started, and I suspect you probably know more about this than I do, so I would be happy to find out about your information. I think it would be presumptuous of me at this early stage to answer. I'm sorry.
I actually asked Rick Burkheiser that question today, and he said down below is where it was that in his mind, but it was the first time he'd ever been there, too.
Yeah,
so
most people think it was on the top where the plaque is, but it wasn't, as far as I understand.
I think we can trust Ron Chernow to get the answer to your question.
Come back 5 years from now.
Our reference book is Hudson River Landings. which is an old book about the Hudson River. I can't think of the author's name right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That leads me to a question for Blanche Cook. I was just in Warm Springs, Georgia, a couple of days ago on my way back up from the south, stopped at the little White House there, and I have some questions about little things like statistics. I asked one of the guards there how many times FDR had gone there, and the guard said 42, and then there's a plaque out on the road that said that FDR had been there 41 times. That's not a big deal, but what it leads to is I also asked how many times FDR had been there during his presidency, and they said 16. And then, because it's always an interesting subject, how many times did his mother come to Warm Springs? And those of you who remember the story, I guess she went to college with him and was there the whole time, and they said once, that she only went there once.
Well, I would really doubt that, because there's a cottage that is known as Sarah Delano Roosevelt's cottage. And one of the things that's really quite remarkable about Warm Springs is it's built really as a country club. And there are very wonderful cottages in the woods. There's a golf course. He wanted his friends to come. He wanted his playmates around. It's a very comfortable vacation place. And lots of Thanksgivings were held there. I'm sure his mother was there for most of the Thanksgivings. I mean, she died in 1941. Almost every year, only 2 or 3 exceptions, there was a family Thanksgiving, and the family was there. So I would really doubt that.
Well, because of all your writings and everything, I know whenever I go any place I start to ask those questions, I'm amazed at how often you get something that isn't quite true. I was at the John Adams grave sites up in Quincy, Massachusetts, and I remember there was a very nice lady taking me around, and she said, you know, John Quincy Adams was so popular that when he died, Senator Abe Lincoln came up here for the funeral. Yes, sir.
First, I want to thank you all for the great job you've done. And I've been waiting to ask the question of you, Mr. Caro, and I'm waiting for your third book on LBJ very eagerly, and I hope to still be here when it comes out. But just in case I'm not, I'm going to ask you the question I've been waiting to have answered about LBJ. Considering a major theme you developed in your 2 books, which is his enormous obsession to become president, his fear that he would die about the age of his dad or his uncles, the powerful determination of the people that supported him to help him achieve his goals, which was to become president, and fourthly, his animosity towards the Kennedys. Packaging that all together, if this were a novel, you were writing a novel, and you write like a novelist, and even though I've lived through these times, I'm eagerly awaiting, the next, even though I know what happened. Have you ever contemplated the possibility that that group, or Johnson or his followers, was involved in the death of Jack Kennedy?
Of course I've contemplated it, and I have not the slightest reason to believe that they were.
Good. Thank you very much.
Next question. Anybody wants a question, to ask a question, please go to that center mic. It'll help us.
I'm just wondering in what way, if any, the task of writing well in a literary sense, with the apt figure of speech or the good sentence cadence, does that assist you in your analysis and interpretation of your subject per se?
Well, I always felt that, glad I got a chance to ask that. People don't usually answer that. People don't usually ask questions like that. I always felt that for a work of nonfiction to endure, the reason it will or it won't endure is if the level of the prose is at the same level as that of fiction. And I wanted to find out if that was true or not in my own mind, so I'll tell you what I did, because I've never been asked this before, I don't think. One summer I wanted to test that out, so what I did was I would read a hunk of Gibbon's Decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Then I'd read a hunk of a novel, historical novel, War and Peace, of comparable length, both of which was endured. I did that the entire summer, a hunk of one and a hunk of the other. And I found that they were indeed written to the same literary standards in every way. Today, when people write nonfiction books, if you're a judge for something, you get whole boxes of books, and what you realize is 90% of these books, the people don't think that the writing matters. They think that all that matters is the facts. But in my opinion, the only books that endure in a nonfiction sense are the ones that are written as well as beautifully with the same narrative force, all the adjectives that you would apply to a novel.
That's a wonderful and important question. And as a professor of history, it really pains me that we're in a moment when students think it's okay to write really obscurantist prose so that only a handful of folks know what you're saying. And it really is important, I absolutely agree with Bob, to write beautifully as you can. And one of the things that I do when I'm writing and I feel like I'm losing my sense of ease is I'll read somebody whose prose I love. Virginia Woolf's letters are a wonderful boost when you're writing. She writes so beautifully, so easily, even in her letters. So that I'll just kind of sit around and read a few of Virginia Woolf's letters and feel, well, I'm going to go back again and rewrite. And it's something one should be very conscious of. And it's deplorable that folks think it's not important.
Yeah, let me just briefly weigh in on this, because I think that when people read a biography, they're encountering two people. They're encountering the subject and they're also encountering the biographer. And I think that the style is extremely important, because if the biographer can charm and engage and captivate and can find a voice that captures the readers on that kind of emotional and imaginative level, people can then be spoon-fed an enormous amount of information, and it's extraordinary how much they can absorb almost without realizing how much they can absorb, because there's kind of a hypnotic quality to the prose, and they are superficially following the fortunes of this character, but at the same time they're absorbing an immense amount of information. I think that if the style is not there, then the facts are heavy and leaden. I think that if the voice is there, suddenly the imagination opens up and the reader can suddenly absorb much more of this story than would ordinarily be the case.
Yes, sir.
Yes, this is a question for Ron Chernow. I was fascinated by your book Titan, but one of the more fascinating aspects of it occurred before it started. And to quote from the dedication, "To my brother, Dr. Bart Chernow, who pulled me back at the last moment from..."
Well, the lovely Valerie is sitting in the audience. No, I would be happy to tell the story. What happened was that in the course of writing the book, I had a massive blood clot. It was a blood clot so large that it actually extended from my ankle to the groin, and it completely occluded the main vein that carries blood to the leg. And I hadn't realized over a 2-month period that this was happening. I woke up in excruciating pain one night. My brother, who's a doctor, was able to diagnose it over the phone, said that my life was in danger, and directed me to an emergency room of a local hospital, and that really saved my life. And then I spent 2 weeks in the hospital hooked up to intravenous blood thinners, and so I figured that if my brother could save my life, the least I could do was dedicate a damn book to him, right? It seemed like a small enough repayment.
If you're not doing anything, we got a job for you at C-SPAN. That's a great question. That's one I should have asked on book notes. Yeah.
Ms. Cook mentioned finding a mean streak in Eleanor Roosevelt, and I know this question must get asked of biographers all the time, but the answers fascinate me. To what extent do you begin a biography as an advocate of your subject? To what extent do you end the biography as an advocate, and what does it feel like to find the nasty stuff in between?
Well, that's really a very wonderful question in terms of me and Eleanor Roosevelt, because there was a long period when I just wanted to stop writing this book, and I was going to stop writing it, as a matter of fact. And that has to do with the period from 1933 to 1938. I have a very painful chapter in this book called A Silence Beyond Repair. And that chapter is about what was going on in Hitler's Europe. All of the information about what was going on was sent to Eleanor Roosevelt. Her friends, Alice Hamilton, Jane Addams, had just returned from a tour of Germany. She met with them in August 1933. So that everything that was going on was known to Eleanor Roosevelt on a daily basis, every day. And for a very long time, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't speak of it. When people would send her letters, "Dear lady, do you know what is going on here?" she would write dismissive replies. It's the only subject on which she wrote dismissive replies. And she would say, "These are things about which we have no control, and I have no authority to speak." But these were very heartfelt letters, and so in the context, they read very coldly. And I thought, well, that's the end of this book. I'm not going to finish this book. And then I found that Eleanor Roosevelt actually did undercover things to get refugees into the United States. And and I found this out touring the Holocaust Museum. There was an exhibit called the Varian Fry exhibit. And this wonderful rescuer named Varian Fry, who is personally responsible for getting a very small, really, handful of the best and the brightest out of Europe just as the gates crash. Hannah Arendt, Marc Chagall, Pablo Casals, 2,000 folks of that order, writes, and this is in the exhibit, "Nothing I was able to do would have been possible had it not been for Eleanor Roosevelt." And so then I began to look for what she did, and that set me onto an entirely different journey. And I was very pleased by that journey. And indeed, Eleanor Roosevelt is the first woman in power or in position of influence to make the connection. Racism, segregation, lynching here, racism, fascism there, white sheets, brown shirts. She makes this connection, and she makes it very early. In 1934, she makes really an amazing public address to the first national meeting of Negro educators, and she says, "The time has come when all discrimination must end. We go ahead together, or we all go down together." And then I looked for her relationship with individual Jewish people and individual refugee folks looking for sanctuary, and it's really quite a dramatic story. But it's a story that really hasn't been told until now. And so I went through waves of different levels of feelings about Eleanor Roosevelt and her circle, Bernard Baruch, Eleanor Morgenthau, who didn't really want her to speak out publicly because it would make it worse here. And I really had to deal with what Arnold Offner called American Appeasement, his wonderful book, American Appeasement. It's really quite a fascinating and important story. And of course, it's not over in this moment when we're witnessing ethnic cleansing again in much of the world. And so issues of rescue and sanctuary and when do you speak out and how do you speak out are utmost on the agenda. And I have to say, in the end, Eleanor Roosevelt is, in my mind, heroic. She gets better and better. She doesn't ever turn her back on controversy. She never says no. No defeat is ever final. And she's there and working to make things better. So in the end, while she has this kind of, it's really competitive. It's really a competitive streak. I shouldn't have said mean. Mean was the wrong word. It's very competitive. And I knew that going into Volume 2 because she, in 1961, at the age of 76, just a year and a half before she died on November 7th, 1962, she wrote a book called You Learn by Living, in which she said the happiest day of her life was the day that she made the first team in field hockey. Now, she wrote this at the end of this incredibly exciting life, and that really gave me great pause. And I got it. Eleanor Roosevelt is a team player. She likes sweaty sports, you know, knockabout field hockey, played in the mud of England, and she's a very competitive woman. She assigned herself the task, the first year as First Lady, to earn as much as FDR did, $75,000 as president. She writes a friend at the end of the year, "I've done it. I've earned as much as Franklin." And she did it in lots of ways that today would be considered very tacky. I mean, Selby shoes, mattresses, Simmons mattresses. She turned down a cigarette sponsor very reluctantly, you know. But she was going to make money. She gave it all away. Very competitive. So it really wasn't a mean streak, but very competitive.
Ron Chernow?
Let me respond to that. I think that there's a very natural human tendency when people are looking at biographical subjects, either to pick somebody whom they admire in order to celebrate that person's virtues, or to take someone whom they detest in order to expose that person. And there have been wonderful books that have been, you know, written in that spirit, but I think there are also dangers. Because the experience of writing biography tremendously intensifies one's emotions to an extent that's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't done it. And it so intensifies feelings that if you start out because you have an intense admiration, you always run the risk of producing a Valentine. You know, similarly, if you start out trying to debunk someone, you're going to spend so much time with them that you can end up with what Joyce Carol Oates called pathography. So I find that at this point, the people who interest me as biographical subjects are the people whom I'm going to wrestle with. And I found that Rockefeller was quite ideal because, you know, I loved him one day and hated him the next. And of course, you find lots of shocking things in someone like Rockefeller's papers, but then it's all the more interesting when you find the redeeming features.
Well, I've had, for me, my opinions of the people I'm writing about changes over the course. When I started, and in opposite ways, I knew the Robert Moses, you know, who ran these expressways across the city and who displaced hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed neighborhoods, and always concentrated on evicting the poor, the black, the Hispanics, because they were the most defenseless. But when I thought that was the kind of book that person I was going to be writing about, however, when you get into the book, when I got into The Power Broker, I realized that there had been a young Robert Moses. Those of you who have read it know that the first 300, 400 pages or so are about an idealist and a dreamer, and a young man who would walk around the city on Sundays with his friend Francis Perkins, trying to find, and Francis Perkins said everything Bob saw made him think of some way it could be better. He was just burning up with ideas, burning up with them. So to see the young Robert Moses, the visionary, the man who wanted power not for the sake of power, but for the sake of his dreams, was a real awakening for me. And when I would talk to him, I would try to get him to tell me about how he had dreamed of Jones Beach, what he had tried to do in housing. Then, of course, as the book went on, we see that power, you know, I always say power is a very unusual weapon. If it's a sword, it's a sword whose handle, as well as the blade, is sharp as a razor. So it cuts into the person who's using it as well as the people on whom it's used, and it changes you. And it changed Robert Moses to a point where gradually power became an end in itself. And he created these huge projects, not primarily to help people, but to create the huge projects. With Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, it was precisely the opposite. When I finished The Power Broker, I was really tired of writing about the last 800 pages about someone that you really felt a great tragedy in what he did. And I wanted to write a book about someone that I could feel more kindly towards in toto. And I had this image of Lyndon Johnson. I remember saying this, I think, on your book notes program many years ago. I thought of Lyndon Johnson as sort of a rural Al Smith, Alfred E. Smith. A guy who was uneducated, never wanted to read very much, but really wanted to help his people. And of course, in the third volume that I'm working on now, that's what Johnson now becomes. This book is called Master of the Senate. And what it's about is how he will do anything to get power, not an assassination, but anything within the context of our political system to get power. But now in the Senate, he gets it. He has it. And we find out how he's going to use it. And what I'm writing about right this very day, as it happens, is how Lyndon Johnson becomes majority leader of the Senate. The South has stopped any civil rights legislation from passing the Senate for 82 years. There are 14 great standing committees in the Senate. Southerners are chairman of the 9 most powerful committees, and Lyndon Johnson sets out to get the first Civil Rights Act passed since Reconstruction. The story of how he does it is noble and wonderful, but to say that that's the end of the Lyndon Johnson story isn't right either, because it's a very mixed story. And what I've really found is that my feelings, not only toward my major characters, but to the minor ones like Al Smith and Sam Rayburn, get quite mixed.
I told Bob Carroll that one of the things we've been doing at C-SPAN, you can't get that on the television network here, but you can get it on the websites, is that we have taken the audio tapes that the library has released. Some of you have seen different programs that have been devoted to that, but we have taken the 250 some hours and devoted 2 hours every Saturday afternoon on our radio station to the chronological playing of these conversations. And you can get them all on the website. As a matter of fact, you can go into cspan.org and find, you can word search, you can find pick a name, somebody that you want to know about, and it'll pop out all of the audio on the tapes of that individual. And in my experience, I've been in Washington now 33 years, to be able to listen to Lyndon Johnson's Oval Office conversations with people from Richard Russell to Hubert Humphrey to J. Edgar Hoover is an extraordinary education. Of course, you ought to buy Bob Carroll's books first as an encouragement before you get into this. But and they're going to release a lot more of them. I understand they've got quite a few more. And I'm really looking forward to Bob Carroll telling us all about these tapes and how they are being released. There was a young lady standing there, wanted to ask a question, and I think we went on too long. Is she still here? Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else have a question in the audience? Yes, ma'am. Question for those who couldn't hear it is the people who don't become famous and don't have biographies written about them, and help me a little bit more. Do you have an idea of someone you're thinking about?
Those people haven't been written about. It's just a theoretical question about the difference between fame and elaborate and the impact of the biographer.
When does somebody become important enough to have a biography written about them?
Well, you know, in all my books, I take these the way things work in publishing today.
We need sound on Bob Carroll's microphone, please. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The way things work now, there isn't much interest among publishers in what they call secondary American historical figures. And if you get into it at all, what you realize is that anyone who isn't a president, basically, or someone like Eleanor Roosevelt, is in the political world, a secondary historical figure. So in each of my books, I think of Sam Rayburn in the first volume. In this volume, Richard Russell, whom you mentioned. I have a whole mini biography of Richard Russell because he embodies the South. And the way I think you should approach such figures who come close to the presidency but don't make it is to use them in a different way, to use them to dramatize, to exemplify the forces that propel them. Like, I never try to give a message in my book. You know, I try to, if the right word is to dramatize things. I said, well, I have to explain Texas populism. Texas populism is something quite fascinating. And if you lived up here in the city like me all your life, you have no idea what it really is. I said, I can either do it in two ways. I can devote a chapter as a lecture to Texas populism, or I can write a small biography on Sam Rayburn, who embodied Texas populism throughout his life. In this volume, Richard Russell, you can either talk about Southern racism and Southern political genius, or you can do it through the life of Richard Russell. I think that's one way of doing it. I don't know if there are other ways.
That's a wonderful question. And I think that as we learn more and look for different questions, more and more people are going to have biographies written about them. I also do what Bob Caro just mentioned. When there are very interesting people, in my book on Eisenhower, for example, I really spend a lot of time and wrote a kind of mini biography within the biography of C.D. Jackson. C.D. Jackson was really the chief propagandist and political warrior of the United States in the Cold War. Nobody has ever written about C.D. Jackson. And if anybody's interested in propaganda and political warfare, that's the man to look for. There are 98 boxes of C.D. Jackson papers that were for many years closed and classified at the Eisenhower Library, but they're now open. So I tell my graduate students in my diplomatic history class every year, somebody, and I now have 2 graduate students working on different aspects for their dissertation on C.D. Jackson. I think he's one of the most interesting people in U.S. history. In the Eleanor Roosevelt biography, nobody has ever written about Esther Lape. Esther Lape is a major American hero. I kind of wrote a sort of mini biography of her in the first volume. There's much more in the second volume. But she's somebody who campaigned for a national health care program from 1935 until the end of her life. She died at the age of 100 in the 1980s. And when Eisenhower signed what really is the first national medical care program, which becomes Medicaid and Medicare, it's actually a health reinsurance. Eisenhower's 1957 law is the health reinsurance thing that gives us GHI, something that was trotted around again recently. He gives the pen that he signs it with to Esther Lape. And Esther Lape waves it to the cameras during the ceremony and says, now this bill represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae of what I had in mind. So I always tell my students, nobody's ever written about Esther Lape. And then there's no real full-bodied biography of somebody as important as Jane Addams. Imagine, no biography of Jane Addams. Part of the reason is that her handwriting is absolutely illegible. But a lot of folks have been at work typing her handwriting. So I suspect there will be several biographies of Jane Addams. And if I have one more second, Brian, I want to say to that other question about how we feel about our subject and how we do our work, and do we come in liking them or disliking them. I think if a biographer is a good biographer, you have to be open to surprises. You have no idea what you're going to find in the documents. And you really should not come in with the story in your mind. You really have to go through those documents. And I think that's really the key.
Ron Chernow?
Yeah, I think that there are really a couple of things going on in history at the moment. I think that because of the concentration in the publishing industry, that it's become increasingly difficult to write biographies where it's not a famous person who has name recognition. Probably if you went to the biography section, this or any other, you would recognize most of the names. And that's basically a commercial reason that we don't like to talk about, because we prefer to talk about the intellectual and literary reasons, but that is a reality. I think that it's not coincidental that people like Bob and I come out of a journalism background because I think, and Blanche I think is something of an exception here, that the great man, or if you will, great woman theory of history is out of favor in the academy. And so that what you find in the academy is sort of the other extreme from what's going on in commercial publishing, where very few academics want to do biographies. It struck me as interesting when I was going through the previous Rockefeller biographies that this sort of biography for decades had been almost exclusively the province of the academics. Alan Nevins had done the standard Rockefeller biography in the 1940s and 1950s, whereas today there is such a vogue in academia for doing books about ordinary life, for people who don't get the biographies, for how ordinary people were living in a period that academics don't take on the sort of big biographies that they did. And, you know, fortunately there are exceptions, Blanche being a good example of that.
In our book notes book, for those of you who are unaware of what's in it, we have done over 500 interviews in the 10 years, and this is our second book. And the idea is to take the spoken word from the transcripts, take my questions out, create small 5-6 page essays, and in this book there are 98 different biographers represented and some 78 different people. And we decided to do this in a nonprofit way, not take any money for it, as a way of furthering all the involvement we have with books. And I want to thank all of our authors for allowing us to do this. They've been all very cooperative in this process, taking the time for the pictures and all that, but especially tonight, and we are out of time here, thank our 3 authors here who have joined us. They've done a great job.
I just want to say, on the behalf of the panels, Brian has been characteristically self-effacing. For me, he's the rock star of the book world at the moment. He always makes us feel extraordinarily important. He never draws any attention to himself, and what he has done with book notes and C-SPAN
I'm the one having all the fun, though. Don't kid yourself. These folks would love to sign a book if you have one, and we'll stick around as long as you're interested. Thanks very much for coming.
If you'd like to get a book signed, please remain seated.